I just, oh yeah.
Yes, thank you. Welcome, everybody. We have a wonderful program tonight, and I am happy to see old friends and new friends here. We are a 25-year-old reading series, and we have, up to the pandemic times, we have met at the Lauren Greeno House in Jamaica Plain, which is an historic 18th century manor house close by with, an elegant drawing room where it's very cozy and nice to gather. And I still miss that venue, but it is wonderful being able to have people gathering from far off places without having to, as Dorothy observed, get through rush hour traffic, which is pretty awful in Jamaica Plain. And the Lauren Greeno House is owned and taken care of by the Tuesday Club, and anybody in Jamaica Plain who is interested in joining the Tuesday Club, that is highly recommended. They're very nice folks, and the dues are pretty low. So I think we don't have to go any further into that. So our first reader will be David McCann. David McCann served in the first Peace Corps group in Korea, 1966 to 68, taught classical Japanese language and literature at Cornell, then Korean literature at Cornell and at Harvard. During graduate studies at Harvard, he took creative writing classes with Elizabeth Bishop, Robert Fitzgerald, Robert Shaw, and Jane Shore. David has published 21 books of and about Korean poetry and cultural history, and 10 books of his own poems. He received the Pushcart Prize in 1978 and Touchstone Award in 2014. A dual language edition of his Seijo poems, which he will explain about Seijo poems, Urban Temple, was published by Bowleaf Books 2010, which was published by Changbi Publishers, Seoul, in 2012. His three recent collections, Same Bird, Lost and Found, and Out of Words, are available from the publisher Moonpie Press. Now, all these places to get the reader's books will be on chat, and you can pick that up towards the end of the reading. Okay, so I am very excited by the expectation of hearing not only David McCann's own poems, which are quite beautiful, and his, but also his translations from the Korean, which are absolutely wonderful. So this is a real treat for me, and I hope it is for everyone else. So please welcome David McCann. And David, please unmute yourself and
should I begin? Good evening, everybody. It's just wonderful to be here. And my thanks to Sandy, Mary, Susanna, and everybody in the Jamaica Pond Poets and Chapter and Verse. I've been to a couple of the readings over there, and they've really been wonderful, but this is the first time that I've been in this situation, and it's really kind of fun. It's also quite terrifying. I went through the poems, reading them with my wife, Anne, who's there this afternoon. And it, as I'm sure we all feel, it's so much fun to go to your own poems and read them and think of others sharing with them as well. what I'm going to be doing this evening is a few haiku poems that I've written in English, and we all know haiku, and then a few shijo poems, and those are the Korean counterpart to the haiku. Their shijo are in 3 lines and Korean language, not classical Chinese. And there's a lot of interest in Korea now in getting the shijo better known around the world, but also some things going on in the US about it. And I have gotten very interested in it. I'll read a few of those. And then, as Mary mentioned, a few of the poems from the book of modern Korean Buddhist poetry that was published a couple of years ago by the Choge Temple Order as part of a 10-volume set on modern Korean Buddhism. And I've also found those poems just quite remarkable. And then I'll close with a few of my other poems and wind up with my very first poem, which my sister Judy shared with me from our mother's journal, going back to 1949, when I won't tell you how old I was, but it was a while ago. But let me start with a few haiku poems. And with the haiku, if you don't mind, what I'll do is I'll read them twice because they are small and they go by quickly. And this is one. Mary, did you suggest this one? It was so nice that you did. It's from the book Out of Words. Gray skies, light snow in May, dishes piled in the sink. Gray skies, light snow in May, dishes piled in the sink. And then a few others from one of my other books, Same Bird. 3 on 1 page, but again, I'll read them each one twice. I was out at the University of Washington for a meeting there many years ago, and just was astonished walking around the University of Washington campus by the cherry blossoms out there. And in fact, they became a little bit overwhelming, and I wrote this poem. Cherry blossoms bullying with all of spring behind it. Cherry blossoms bullying with all of spring behind it. And that poem is one, as sometimes happens, came to me in the 2 languages. The Japanese version of that is Obiakasu sakura no hana ya haru ni naru. Obiakasu sakura no hana ya haru ni naru. Haru ni naru means becoming spring. And sakura no hana is the cherry blossoms. And obiakasu is intrusive. The next one is a poem that I discovered in one of my longer poems, rereading it some years ago. And I came to this set of 2 lines and I thought, gosh, that feels like a haiku poem. And I took it out and I sent it off to Acorn Journal, Haiku Journal. And the editor out there said, that looks pretty good, but why don't you take off the period at the end? And I did. And they published it. It's as follows. Do you want me? She whispers and turns to leaves. Do you want me? She whispers and turns to leaves. And then a poem actually from an experience in Korea when my wife and I and our daughter visited a Buddhist temple near Daegu, the city down in the southeast. We had climbed up the pathway to the temple and we're walking around, and this image just stuck with me. In the earth dark kitchen, a monk rinses luminous basins of rice. In the earth dark kitchen, a monk rinses luminous basins of rice. So those are some of the haiku. Now let me try a few shijo with you. As I think I mentioned, the shijo has been around for centuries, the Korean language counterpart to the Japanese haiku, only it's a larger verse form. It's 3 lines. The first line is said to get the poem going, the second line to develop it further, and then the third line starts with a change and then a resolution. And each line is in sort of 4 rhythmic groups. And over the centuries, the shijo were sung as well as being composed in various ways. And then in the 20th century, people tried to bring them into the modern age. And then, as I mentioned, the Korean Shijo Poets Association and others are very actively trying to get more people aware of them outside of Korea. Just so you know what it sounds like, here's the first line of a famous 16th century Korean Shijo poem in Korean. And you'll notice it's in 4 parts. 청사리 벽계수야 수위 감을 자랑 마라, which would be, jade green stream, don't be so proud of your easy passing through these blue hills. It's a very famous shijo poem. And I'll read you, if I may, my very first shijo, which I happened to write in Korean about my time back in the Peace Corps in Andong. I was teaching at the Andong Agriculture and Forestry High School, and the teachers would once or twice a week go into town, and we'd go to a restaurant, sit around a table on the floor, and have great food and some makgeolli to drink, and tell stories and sing songs and recite poems. But then I had to get home to the place where I was living before 12 o'clock because there was a 12 o'clock curfew in Korea. And my room was right next to the pig pen. And the pigs knew when I was coming home. And here's the poem I wrote about that. I'll give it to you first in Korean and then translation. 하룻밤 안동 시내 골목 술집 구경하고 머리가 빙빙 돌 때 밭둑길을 거닐다가 또야지 꿀꿀 소리야 이제 왔노 하노라. Which in English is, one night in Andong, after a tour of back alley wine shops, head spinning, I staggered down the narrow paddy field paths when the 2 pigs grunted, so you home at last. That was my very first. Here's one I wrote in English, inspired by Higgins Beach up in Maine. It's called Vast the Sea, but it's not that sea at Higgins Beach, it's the letter C. Vast the sea. Vast the sea that starts the word crustacean, closed on one side, open to all the alphabet of possibilities out the other. Crabs, lobsters, a great pile of shrimp. Let the feast begin, shells cracking. This is a poem that I wrote when I was doing a sequence on the 7 deadly sins. I mean, when you're desperate for something to write about, why not 7 deadly sins? And the one I picked here was avarice. And it's about me trying to swim at the lake up in Jaffrey, where our friends Mark and Sally have a beautiful place by the lake. And I have to confess, I'm not a great swimmer, and I barely managed to get out to the float and was lying there gasping for breath. And my dear wife, Anne, swam out as easily as she usually does and helped tow me back to the shore. So this is what I want. Avarice, envy denied, frustrated, sublimated. What I want, I need and deserve. I need to have what you possess, your calm skill as you swim the lake to the float where I lie gasping. And then another one for Ian. I was again out at the University of Washington in Seattle for a few days of a conference at a different time of the year. Just loved it, walking around and seeing everything going on the campus and looking off to the mountain over to the east. And then on my way back, as I was heading for the airport, this poem came to me. It's called One for Anne. Like a squirrel digging nuts up, or those crows turning dead leaves over, I go places and take poems. This one from the back seat of the cab on its way to the airport. When I get home, it's all yours. It's all yours. Well, now, let me share with you a few modern Korean Buddhist poems, part of the anthology that I translated. And these are all 20th century poets. A couple of them were people I got to know when I was in Korea doing work on my dissertation research and other things over the years. The book itself is called The Temple of Words. And it's a lovely title, I think, because if you take the word in Korean for poetry, it's from a Chinese character. And the Chinese character is of two pieces, one of which is temple and the other is words. And that's a poem. I just kind of love that. And let me give you a couple of poems. The Choge Temple Order very kindly allowed me to put a few of the poems, the translations, in this book, Out of Words. The first one is called Ferryboat and Traveler and is by the poet Han Young-un, who lived from 1879 to 1944 and was a major figure in literature, but also in the Korean national resistance movement against the Japanese colonial occupation, and a powerful member of the Korean Buddhist order. And he spent many, many years up in the mountains, just an amazing person, then back in the center of town. But this one is called Ferryboat and Traveler. I am the ferryboat, you the traveler. You step down on me with muddy feet. I hold you and cross over the water. When I hold you, then shallow waters or deep or swift rapids, I do cross over. If perchance you do not come, then exposed to the wind, facing snow and rain from night into day, I wait for you. Once you have crossed over the water, you do not turn to look back at me, but I always know of your coming, waiting for you. Day after day, I go on growing older. I am the ferryboat, you the traveler. Korean readers tend to refer to this poem as being about the Buddhist scriptures, as being the ferryboat carrying us on our journeys. I've also thought of it maybe as being about a poem carrying us across. But it's just amazing. You can hear the ring of it in the title in Korean. Narutpewa Hengin. Narutpe is the ferryboat and Hengin is the traveler. Here's a poem by Hyobong, who lived from 1888 to 1966. Sermon on the Dharma. One step, two steps, 3, 4 steps. Go, not falling left, right, forward, or back. Reaching there, closed off by mountains and waters. One more step and be there in that well-found place. And then this last of the ones I'll read by Joji Hun, lived from 1920 to 1968, called Ancient Temple. Tapping the wood fish, overcome by drowsiness, the handsome young monk child too has fallen asleep. Wordless, the Buddha smiles, while along the myriad league western regions, under a dazzling evening sky, peonies fall. Oh, they still do it to me when I read those poems. Let me read a few of mine now. I'll start with one called At Manheim Village from my book, Urban Temple, the collection of Shijo poems. Manheim Village is up in the mountains on the eastern side of the Korean peninsula. And it's where Han Young-un, the poet who did the ferry boat and the traveler, where he was for several years, the head monk and studying. And a group of us went there for a conference on modern Korean poetry. And near the temple was a reconstructed old style village, Manheim Village. And we were looking around and visiting the temple site. And this came from that. Mystified by the dark light, yet eager to try the drum, the great bell, hollow wood fish, bronze hammered plaque that calls the birds one by one. As the monk calls us, we step forward and begin. We all took turns banging that big gong. It was just, and also hitting the wood fish, dock, dock, dock. I'll do some from another collection, Same Bird, to kind of wind up. Same Bird is the title poem in this gathering. And this bird happens to be in Venice. My wife and I visited there several years ago. But my father, who passed away a few years ago, but got very interested himself in Shijo. But he just had this wonderful sense of humor about the world, its situation. And so there's this poem called Same Bird. So what's different? I asked my dad, where we stand on the sidewalk outside the house, just back with his new hearing aids. Do you hear that bird over there? Same bird, he grins, but nearer. This is a sequence of 3 Shijo. Too ill to talk. That last day, too ill to talk, after the chat with my father, I said I'd call next morning and catch up some with mother. Telephone ringing brought the news. We are alone. She is gone. September 1 year ago, vacation done, the beach visit, a last trip to Korea. Who could have known October's blight? We are left to endure the silent treatment, and she is gone, still, always. Winning is overrated, vastly. Losing is everything. Losing weight or altitude, bringing it back where it began. My mother lay down on the floor one day last year. We are lost. How much time do I have? A few minutes more? Are we doing okay?
You have a couple more minutes if you like.
Couple more would be just right.
Okay.
Okay, good. I'll do one, not terribly long, but just one of those poems that comes to you as you're starting to write. And who knew that it would wind up on the hills north of Portland, Maine? It's called An Army of Readers. The room all stiffens to attention. The officer barks, "As you were." We all go back to what we were, but when? This one, 19 years old again, and mad about the girl he'd met, their walks, the secret places they'd begun to discover in each other. The woman at this other desk simply is gone. You will find her here, attending to these lines, their dips and continuing flow, how they resemble, she remembers, the backcountry 2 lanes away from the coast in Maine, driving on an August afternoon, all the windows down, the wind hot against her face, tugging her hair loose, coming to a 3-mile run of straight road, up and down a few short hills in that stretch somewhere north of Gray, and a half-mile ahead, another car making its way. She didn't pause to consider why. She just floored it. The old Merc jumped to 70, 80, and broke past 90 as she flew over the top of the last hill. At this last desk, not to be outdone, in the beam of sunlight that rests like a covered bridge between it and the windowsill, a pale yellow butterfly dances toward the glass. And then let me close with this first poem ever, which I mentioned my sister Judy discovered in our mother's journal from 1949. My mother put the quotation marks around David's first poem. I turned on my light at night when it was dark. I had a dream about people flying a kite, but those people got in a fight. There we are. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. It's been a pleasure. And I hope you did not consider that terrifying. I hope you had fun.
It was fun. Thank you. Yeah.
Because we certainly did. And we certainly enjoyed the humor and just the well, the light, the thing that goes farther in our life than just the surface,
Well,
that you
thank you.
find in a sort of Buddhist sensibility, shall we say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the chance to revisit those poems. Thank you.
Yes, and it was just fascinating hearing the Korean language, which is so melodious, and it is indeed like the ringing of bells and tapping of wooden fish when you hear it spoken. So thank you so much. Yes. And so next we are going to have Gregory Lestage, and we are just excited to hear Gregory Lestage. He is a Jamaica Plain person. He lives in Jamaica Plain with his 3 daughters and Great Pyrenees puppy, Winifred. We would like to meet Winifred too, as well as your daughter. He is a former academic who left university life many years ago for the challenges of the business world. He is now a senior executive in a global management consulting firm. His passions include tinkering with his antique vehicles and 1830s farmhouse. Sounds beautiful. and Barn on Cape Cod. He received his PhD and MA from Oxford University and his BA from Trinity College. His poetry collection, Small Gods of Summer, was a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Prize. And Hope is a Small Barn was the runner-up for the Julia Ward Howe Prize. He is currently working on his next collection. His books are available on Amazon or from the poet himself. And that is also on chat. Okay. So welcome, Greg Lestage. It's a very great pleasure, Greg.
Greg, we can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now? How about now?
Yes, better.
Got it. Thank you for that introduction, and also I'm humbled to be part of this series that's been running for so long. I'm always very impressed by things like that, so thank you. And David, thank you too for your reading. I love your commitment to form, that you've studied it, you've lived it, and that you've written it, and that's hard to do, particularly for so long. So thank you for that. What I thought I would do here too is read from two of my books, and then also share some new work that will be coming up in this next book. And I'll give a little preface to each one, but not much, and look forward to any discussion after that. I'll read first from my book, Small Gods of Summer. And it's a poem about having a particular strong emotion, but no word for it. Really gets at the limits of language and a sense of powerlessness because of it. It's called Unring the Bell. Make me one word that means the nostalgia and sadness I feel in the very moment that is delighting me. It must collect like a crucible, that hollow bowl at the bottom of a furnace that pools what does not burn away. It must fence walk, Janus-faced, dervish on the pinhead of the instant, see through a fisheye, spell what Escher drew. It must cyclone like regret, all downdraft and disappearance, and flywheel like hope, that spindler of the bright side. Then make me another word that I can say in the aftermath, a talisman that unblinks the eye, unsays the tell, uncasts the die, unrings the bell. Through a lot of my work, I have explored childhood and memory, in this case, boyhood, and how the past affects the present and how we think about it, and the present, of course, reinterprets the past. And I do that through my own childhood memories. In this case, is a poem called Pennies on the Rail. And it's about a boyhood adventure, but it's also about the innocence of ignorance, or the ignorance of innocence when you're young and not aware of what's going on around you. In this case, it's a dying mill town and a worried and weary father. Pennies on the Rail. At dusk, I filled my pockets with pennies and walked north out of my neighborhood, slipping past cavernous Victorians haunted by low renters, and over dirt lots where my grandmother once flew her kite in the grass. I skirted east along the main avenue, where every third house slowly sloughed its history onto the yard. Men carpooled into driveways, past the litter of roof tiles and shingles. I met a friend on the way, and we snuck to the riverbank to single file down the tow path tightrope. The water, palsied by the dam, smelled of metal. The mill, just emptied of clock punchers, tilted at our backs. At dusk, my father left his factory in his Chevy and drove past the past he had inherited as a son of the town, his route home, a downward spiral of byways, lined with flaking husks of foundries. Nail salons and mini-marts obscured what was gone, were palimpsests in neon. At the footbridge, we felt late and ran until we reached the chain-link fence that kept us from the railbed. The same fence that was not there in my great-uncle's stories of hobos freely coming and going from tracks to river to beg at the back doors of the grand houses that lined the banks, and of how they were received by the rich. We slunk like weasels under the fence and up onto the blanket and ballast shoulder to line our pennies on the rail, split seconds it seemed, before the 5:15 from Boston rumbled past and flattened them into ovals and oblongs, good luck pieces. In our palms, they burned and cooled and shined with only the faintest trace of their original design. Back at home, my father, newly arrived with his own flattened cents, fingered my treasure and told me that when he was my age, he gave all of his copper to the war effort. I'm going to read from my most recent book now, Hope is a Small Barn, a poem that is called Rescuing Mermaids. And it really is what I'm trying to get at is about a male's limited perspective of and understanding of relationships between women, compassion, solidarity, commiseration, shared plight, and just sort of that sense of distance that we or I can feel. Rescuing mermaids. When an envy of mermaids beached itself, my daughters set about rescuing them from certain death or something worse. I suspect that they administered a kind of serum passed from hands to scales and palmed cups of seawater. No man can comprehend this, of course, nor could I decode what they spoke to the revived, but figured it must have been gentle dissuasion. One by one, the flopping subsided, and they let themselves be dragged seaward by the hands, their limp tails leaving trails in the sand and slicks of oil flecked with glitter. They sank at the surf line with what must have been resignation. I imagine that they recovered under the breaking waves and darted through kelp curtains into the familiar. Later, my girls reported that they heard keening while they were diving for shells. They explained that it was less a protest than a peal of regret. Going back to the theme of childhood and boyhood, and that sense that it's sort of getting at what we knew as children, and can we hang on to that notion of what we knew then and what we know now, and what we know now and what we know then, and are they different? And what happens to us? It's called I Will Show You What Kestrels Do. And kestrels are very small birds of prey. Give me boyhood again, and I will show you what kestrels do in the Tiffany of dusk, on the concave of the wind, holding the hover over the meadow's lacework, heir to what is about to happen, everything fine spun with intent. And we will thread the lane in short bursts of flight to a house known to my compass. And I will turn your ear towards the distant ledge of the day where a red fox sends a yowl to itself around the pine rim bowl of the bay. The answer that returns no more or less changed than what I had become to myself, woven, tapestried, then set aside, until I admit, when it all comes back around, that I neither left nor arrived.
I'm not sure what happened here. I think he may have had some little domestic catastrophe. Hopefully the Great Pyrenees puppy has not done something terrible. But here he is again. I hope everything's okay, Greg.
We can't hear you again. Sorry.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Greg.
We did hear you for a while there, but Mary, do you think should we move on to the next reader and then see if we can come back to Greg?
Yes, let's move on to Claire, and then we will come back. Oh, he's connecting to audio.
Ah, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, we can hear you.
Fine, okay.
Sorry, it threw me out. I apologize. A little dramatic tension there. Let me keep moving here, and I want to be conscious of our time here, Mary. I, growing up, was very fond of Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree, which many of us may have studied in school. And it always moved me because it was such a strong sense of place, so that the imagery and the ethos, deeply personal, healing, very connected to nature. And actually hearing Yeats read himself, I found very captivating. So I've tried to create my own version of that, a poor version, but the attempt all the same. And it's called Frostfish Cove. Go down to Frostfish Cove with all cares at your back, when the high tide makes green scythe tips of the marsh grass and floats the tide dinghy for easy boarding. Go down to Frostfish Cove by the path through the woods, where bittersweet climbs the Scotch pine groves and the briny breeze, and yellow jackets hide in the leaf litter. Go down to Frostfish Cove, across the field of Timothy, through the scribble of cabbage butterflies, and beneath the white oak where the black dazzle of assembling crows gossips about your intent. Go down to Frostfish Cove from the ancient tract, where flint-cored farmers pushed from the soil what the glacier left, then toiled seeds into rows as the fishing catches and tides cycled at their backs. A poem called Never Such Harmony. And I wanted to write a piece about the act of gathering with people that we love around a meal in a place that we love, and the particular kind of harmony that we feel when that happens. And this is an attempt to capture that moment. Never such harmony. Never such harmony at home as when our place and our people join at the violet hour and make and break bread beneath a sheltering sky under a star-strung strand of tiny lights, when each savory word gets its just desserts in sweet reply, while the wine glasses chime the time and laughter is the subject and the object, where conversation warms the irises of eyes until they bloom, internally lit, then bouquet into affection when they lean towards the candlelight. After the moon and the jazz, the carillon of peepers in the pond, and the rosining of crickets' bows have wheeled us onward, after the fireflies have flicked their lighters in the crowd, and the June bugs have clung to the screen doors for the last swig of lampshine, we find ourselves in the awaited province of the night to which we have traveled, so that honesty, that nocturnal thing, will come to eat from our hands. This book, Hope is a Small Barn, has two very long poems in it. My first attempt at doing that, and I won't read them to you because they're very long. But I will read 6 stanzas from a 32 stanza piece called The Hunt. And it's a contemplation, or my contemplation of aging, male aging in particular, and how there's a sense of becoming members of a group or inheriting a process from our forefathers, and searching for something that's really never quite there, or that you can never quite find. This is the first 6 stanzas of The Hunt. By the time I joined the hunt, it was ancient and eternalized by millennia of spore, footprints, nests of boughs, possible scat. No hunter was handpicked, no tracker dragooned. We were self-draftees. Some of us goateed with satchels full of high school slights, notepads with penciled grudges, with inventions for seeing around corners, with fathers in tow and long dead. Some of us were stooped and stubborn from years of studying manuals and barely losing arguments. All of us trammeled but undamned, let fly to chase and reify by a triggered chromosome and notions of lack. We moved together less like starlings and more like a loose affiliation of kin, necklaced with binoculars and cameras, strapped with crossbows and carbines. Down the ages, our forefathers had vouchsafed scratchings on parchment and sketches on vellum. They had scrawled lists on index cards, left them for us in safety deposit boxes, crannied them in walls of hideouts and humidors. What they traced gave contour to our prey, but without color or punctuation were just smudged guesswork, flax-speak boast filtered through bourbon. We rambled down the meltwater braids of the outwashed plains and swifted the wide ridge moraines. We prowled the glacial till, the kettled and old countryside, poking sticks into holes and volleying our voices into caves, because sometimes the beast was almost there. I'll finish here by reading a few new ones. And I think many of these no one has heard before, so here goes. One is called The Stone Wall, and it actually is after Robert Frost's Mending Wall, if you are familiar with that. And the first line underneath it is a line from that poem, which is, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down." It was always there, cleaving the field in two between the old road and the woods, slowly succumbing to the suck of the soil, into the forest of black locust trees that rose around it, while their roots carried out a silent sunder from below, one stone at a time, it seemed, over a century, to implicate us as the topplers of some rock-bone colossus, the mostly buried spine its only remains. After the fleam and gullet of the saws worked their angles and valleys in the trunks, and the trees came down in jackstraws, we bent our backs and crowbars, broke shovels, broke the green grip of what cloyed to the stones, set fire to all that was not birthed as magma from the earth's mantle. We brought machines in and fresh men. We trucked boulders from the local quarry to fill holes and gaps. What we rebuilt served nothing but the brute joy of rebuilding, the serenity of the mindless, because there is really nothing to divide, nothing to keep us in or out at this stage in our lives. It is now a task without end. There I still am in the August swelter, gamely piling up stony permanence while the ants succeed in the interstices and the cicadas rail in the red maples about the brevity of it all. Years ago, I found a seal carcass on the beach and buried it at the field's edge to let nature perform its subtraction. I will dig it up after some spring thaw and wire the bones together and hang it so that it moves with the breeze off the bay like a seal remembering itself. The lone stone dreaming of the wall, the single bone of the body, the word of the book, the kinship of freefall when it all must stop working in order to work again. I'll just read one more, and it's a love poem. And this most recent version has a lot more of that than the previous ones. It's called The Water of You. When it is time to show her that the water of you, all that is salt and brack, serene and slack, flowing and shining in black blue, is converging in her, go to that narrow river where there are more bends and straits, and bleached cedars stand forever silvering, and spans of smooth cordgrass reach up green and rippling, and a bank of umber sand havens the kingfisher, who waits in his hole for you to return with the future in your arms. Kiss her deeply while you float entwined, and begin to entrust to her what is below, the rhythms of the oysters and eels, the warp and weft of the velvet weed, all of the life under your skin, the blood flow, the pulse of your mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I love how your poems are these rich, rich journeys with a scenery of image and music. It's very lovely. Thank you so much. And
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
no, that was a little, we were a little worried about you, but
Me too.
fortunately you came back pretty quickly, so that's okay. That's okay. So next is Clare Beams, okay? And I am happy to welcome Clare Beams back to Boston. She is, her novel, The Illness Lesson, published in February of 2020 by Doubleday, was named a New York Times Editor's Choice, a best book of 2020 by Esquire and Bustle, and was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. Her story collection, We Show What We Have Learned, was published by Lookout Books in 2016. It won the Bard Fiction Prize and was a Kirkus Best Debut of 2016. A new novel, The Garden, will be published by Doubleday in 2023. She lives in Pittsburgh with her husband and 2 daughters. The book can be ordered from the bookshop website and other, and that will be on chat, all the places where the books can be ordered. So please welcome Clare Beams.
Thank you so much, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay,
Yes.
Good. Thank you to Mary and to Sandy and to Susanna for making this all work, and to David and Greg. Your work is beautiful, and it's really a pleasure to read with you tonight. So I think I'm just going to read the first chapter of my novel, The Illness Lesson, which came out in February. I could have timed that a little better. Came out literally 2 weeks before we all locked down. I got to go on about a third of my book tour. So I'm just going to read the first chapter, which is not all that long. So this will be not all that long. The book, all you really need to know, since this is the first chapter, is that we are in a fictional town called Ashwell, Massachusetts, and that the year is 1871. And this chapter is called Birds Again. The first of the birds Caroline mistook for her own mind's work. When the streak of red crossed the kitchen window pane, fast, disastrous bright, she thought it was some bloody piece come loose inside herself. Then her father appeared from the study and held the door frame, leaning in. Caroline, did you see? They found it in the yard, real after all, high in their birch tree, pecking judiciously at the bark. The size of a dove, the shape of a crow, and a brazen crimson tip to tail feathers, the shade a cardinal might bloom to if dipped in wine. It had a crestless head, all sharp planes. As the Hoods watched, it took a choosy bird step forward, then craned neck over back to root around in its wing. No question at all, Samuel Hood said. His hand on Caroline's arm felt slight. This shock had dislodged his usual serenity, and in his face she saw old age, the way his features would fold in on themselves. To brace them both, she gripped his fingers. Trilling hearts, who'd have believed? A trilling heart, Caroline said. She had just one hazy, red-tinged memory of the Trilling Heart's only prior appearance in Ashwell, 25 years earlier. Standing barefoot in the grass of the front garden, 4 years old and afraid to go down the path because of the bird that stood guard there, chopping up a worm with its brutal beak. Snip, 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 worm bits on the gravel. On the steps behind her, sewing in the sun, her mother. What can this mean, her father asked. That there's a red bird in our tree. Samuel put a hand to his shirt front. When he was a boy, his appendix had almost burst before the surgeon managed to remove it, and in moments of great excitement, a heat and pain phantom seemed to revisit him. Sometimes Caroline found him with his fingers pressed there while he wrote and knew he was imagining readers, roomfuls of them, schools of hands turning reams of his pages. There is some significance, he said. The immensities of God's creation often whittled themselves down to make a message for her father. But in this wouldn't anyone read meaning? The red flash, the answering thrum. You know it was your mother who named them, Samuel said, as if speaking about a person who'd stepped into another room. Caroline tried again to turn her 4-year-old head, to leave off staring at the bird and catch sight of her mother's face. You never told me, she said. I must have. Well, when we first saw them, a group of us out walking in the afternoon, just happening upon them in the fields, you can't imagine. She said they put her in mind of hearts, scooped right out of chests. Disembodied, trilling hearts, she said. The bird's shape was wrong for this description, but its feel was right. The trilling heart looked like something safer left hidden. Do you think David will be here in time to see? Samuel said. As always, David's name sounded louder than the rest of the words. And I must tell Hawkins, I'll write him today. Hawkins will know if there have been others spotted. He's told me nothing grows or flies or runs in Massachusetts without his permission. Caroline hadn't seen George Hawkins or any of the Birch Hill men in years, but she could picture the set of his mouth in delivering this not quite jest. He was a physician, only an amateur naturalist, but the sort of man who never considered himself an amateur at anything. They all were. The bird raised its head again. Its black eye had the sightless sheen of a drop of oil. It tossed some bit of bark or insect back and swallowed it down, muscular throat squeezing. I ought to send a drawing with the letter. Caroline, would you? You have a fine hand. She breathed in on the swell of pride that came when her father praised her and stared at the bird to memorize it, so that in the drawing itself she might earn that praise again. She noted the shape of the head, the shining, sharp-looking lines of the wings, the beak like a long, cruel tooth, the sweep of the tail feathers, that red, improbable shade. The bird flew away before David arrived, so they went back inside to wait. Samuel wrote and Caroline drew. I wonder what's keeping him, Samuel said, but this was David he was talking about, his last disciple and unexpected hope. He didn't say more. In the confluence of Caroline's two projects, the drawing and the waiting, a strange suggestion was taking hold. Only one bird, she reminded herself. Still, she tried to capture the line of the bird's beak and thought, perhaps. She shaded its eye and thought, perhaps. Considering slowed her hand. Her trilling heart had only the basic outline of a back and head by the time her father hurried to meet David at the front door. From 2 rooms away, Caroline heard them clearly. The founders of the Birch Hill Consociation had tried to plug the drafts of this 100-year-old farmhouse when they'd bought it, but they were men with a greater affinity for ideas than for planks. Astonishing, her father was saying. I never thought I'd see them again, not on this earth. I'd forgotten their look, such a red. I wish I'd seen, David said, and Caroline wished for a basket full of trilling hearts that she might carry to him, pinned against the shelf of her hip bone. Caroline must have nearly finished sketching by now. Before the door opened and they were upon her, she just had time to cover the page. Caroline, her father said, flushed and smiling. Not yet. David inclined his head, but her father went on. Surely you've caught at least some part of the essence, enough to give David an idea. No 2 men in all the world to whom she would have been less willing to show a half-formed thing. Just another half hour. I'll bring it to you in the study. Her father darted with a boy's nimbleness and caught the drawing out from where she'd hidden it. He held it in the air and squinted. Ah, well, not done. This is the basic shape though, David. Nearly. Caroline's father had written a great and famous essay against cruelty, which scores of New England schoolchildren could quote from memory. She had seen him stop a man in the street who was striking his horse. Oh, yes, David said. Samuel set the sketch gently back down on the tabletop. He led David to the study and closed the door. Caroline left the house. She strode off across the grass. She drove her legs forward as punishment, her own fault, always mostly her own fault, and sweat prickled the back of her neck beneath her heavy hair. A deep, dark forest of hair, her father used to say when she was a child and kissed the top of her head. She'd thought he meant she had magic, or magic would happen to her. As she passed the line of trees that obscured the house from view, she didn't slow, not until she had climbed the top of the main hill. Below, their fields were spread, rich enough for eating, as if someone had taken up a heaping knifeful of sweetness and stroked it across the ground to tempt the appetite. The whole of the Birch Hill experiment needed no more explanation than that the weather must have been fine on the day they first saw the land. The sloping green of the fields in the sun, stands of trees clustered here and there, each casting its shade like the dark, wet spill of an overturned bowl. The hills that grew greener and larger in the distance until at last they became mountains and blue. The air thick with its grass and heather baked dirt smell. The chorus of humming, chirping, buzzing things in the grass, a small riot like the voice of the soil itself. The land had the same overabundant beauty as Samuel Hood's essays, and so those men had all come here to found a bright-colored world on both. And when the Trillingharts had arrived, a month into their project, it had felt like God himself was telling them, oh yes, just what I envisioned. Here, my final touch. By all means, proceed. Important, Caroline thought, to remember this time how that time had turned out. She let herself run down the far side of the hill. The ground gave a little beneath her feet. The neighbor boy had come a few days earlier to help them with the July haying, and there was nowhere Caroline could go, not even her bedroom, without tasting cut grass. Caroline crossed the little valley, climbed the farther hill, and there, in the apple orchard at the crest, she found 2 Trillingharts twitching amongst the leaves of the largest tree. The first, the brilliant color of the bird from this morning. The other, it must have been a female, a tamer red-brown. Not just one bird anymore then. Whatever was happening here, it was doubling. The tree they occupied at the orchard center was the only one the Birch Hill founders hadn't planted. The farmer who'd sold them the land had done that, and the only one that had ever thrived, bearing full, ripe fruit in the fall. The birds knew better than to trust their weight to the other spindly branches. Caroline watched them move in lines instead of curves, start, stop, pecking at the surface of the world. Those beaks she could almost feel somewhere along her spine. She saw that she'd gotten the angle of their backs slightly wrong in her sketch. David wanted to see them. He could see them now if she brought him. But back at the house, she found David and her father on the front lawn watching more birds. 5 Trillingharts hopped from branch to branch in the oak by the front door. All on their own, without her help, David's eyes followed, and childish disappointment made her throat ache. Look, Caroline, her father shouted, though she'd stopped right beside him. More in the orchard, too, she said. Samuel turned to David. Now, I think, what better time? They've almost made our announcement for us. David nodded. The certainty settled heavy in Caroline's chest. My father has hatched some scheme and David is leaving. Samuel whistled into the sky. The birds flapped a little at the sound as if it were a greeting. I feel 20 years younger. Crisply, Caroline said, what are you talking about, please? We have news, Caroline. We've been making plans, David and I, to open a school. The first of its kind for the training of intellects and souls, hearts and minds, a school here for girls. What girls? Caroline said. David laughed. Any of them, all of them, Samuel said. Any who want what they couldn't find in any other girls' school. A true transforming education, dearest, like the one you've had. His fingertips grazed her arm. The education that had grown a wilderness in her head, too large to fit into any available space she'd yet found, so that she'd always wondered what her father had planned for her exactly, if he'd planned anything, if he hadn't just taught her all of it because she was there and because he could. We'll be filling a hole in the educational landscape, Samuel was saying. No one has done this before. Form girls into women who can become their own best selves, who can be true partners to their husbands and true mothers to their children. Our school will be a pursuit of the divine in the human. We'll teach thinking, not sewing or physical graces, not shallow parlor trick erudition. We'll teach them to read the text of the natural world. Samuel Hood, essayist. It's unprecedented, he said. But Caroline thought all of this would have sounded familiar to the Birch Hill men, only the direction of its application had changed. Of course, there's the matter of what they're to do with all that after, she said. She did not look at David. Then her father surprised her. He stepped forward and caught her hand. I know, he said softly. My dear, I do know. That's why this school is so important as a first step. There's nothing to do with it. We'll make something to do while we're making the doers. Another small beginning meant like Birch Hill to ripple. Shouldn't her father understand that the ripples did not always follow? Birch Hill hadn't lasted 2 years. And yet, a bird adjusted its wings, and Caroline thought she almost heard the slight friction of feather against feather. One impossible thing might follow another. Her father did mean what he was saying, she knew. He always did. And about girls, who else said and meant such things? She hadn't realized her father understood what it felt like to her. Samuel gripped her shoulder. You'll teach with us, Caroline. You'll help us shape what we're doing. Caroline had briefly tried being a teacher. She hadn't been sure what else to try, equipped with the education he'd given her, tied to this place. So 3 years earlier, she'd gone to work at the Ashwell Grammar School. A few of the children she'd adored, but when she raised her hand one afternoon to strike a boy who'd thrown gravel in another boy's face, she only just remembered to open her fist. She'd returned to Birch Hill and told her father that the world wasn't served by the troughs and peaks that teaching seemed to bring her to. Teaching didn't suit me, remember? She said. David answered, no one has taught the way we'll teach here. Fluttering on its branch, one of the birds gave its call, a single rapidly repeating note, almost mechanical in tone, but lighter, higher, the sound of a quick tongue ticking on teeth. Sir, for the name, David said. He bounced on his feet as if testing the ground. The School of the Trilling Heart, what do you think, in honor of the circumstances? Joy suffused Samuel's face. There were words that might have plucked him down to earth again, but Caroline couldn't bear, in that moment, to say them. And I'll stop there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Claire. That is a fascinating opening chapter to a book that just becomes more and more marvelous in many ways as you read. So I do urge everyone to go to this novel because it is quite fascinating, and there's a sort of a reflection back onto some of the poems that the men have just read here. You know, this sense of you know, trying to understand what women are thinking and feeling, and not really catching the voices, perhaps, or being, you know, something where there is, you know, that kind of a sort of a gap between human beings, and you see it a lot between men and women. But thank you so much. I loved your book.
Oh, thank you so much for reading it and for having me. This is such a pleasure.
Yes, and right now, I think we are done with the reading. So if you like, you can unmute yourself, and you can, we can give another round of applause to all our readers, and then have, perhaps, if there are questions, comments on chat, or we can get acquainted a little. Oh, Alan is raising his hand.
Hi, congratulations to the two poets and the wonderful novelist. This was delightful. I have a question for David. The question is, for you, what is a haiku? The reason I'm asking you the question is because your haikus were, well, 3 lines of poetry, but they didn't have the 5-7-5 syllables. So obviously that doesn't matter to you. They were very effective. And so I wanted to ask you, what is for you a haiku, David?
Oh my, have we got 3 years? I'll try my best. Well, one way to describe it, of course, is the way you just mentioned, that it doesn't have to be the 5-7-5 pattern in the syllable count. But that does then suggest the 3 pieces to the haiku. And I've heard it sometimes described as, the intersection of the momentary with the permanent, with the eternal. And then there are examples of that from, like, for example, Basho, the famous poet from Japan, his poem about ancient pond, the frog jumps in, the sound of water. And you can get another of his poems from his Okuno Hosamichi, the narrow road to the deep north, where he's looking at the ruins of a castle from some centuries before, and summer grasses of brave men's dreams, what remains. And there's, some sense of this other world, not the human, not the I of the poet speaking, but the poet writing down reflections of the world out there. Often people say you have to have some sort of season word. And I think there are different journals and groups of haiku writers who more or less agree with that, but some indication of one of the 4 seasons, and then some moment in it. But I find it a very interesting and very challenging form. And I write a lot of small poems, and I find others in the bigger poems of my collections of various kinds. And I just am very much aware of the fact that I'm always looking still. If you look out at the beach up in Maine, you'll see a rock and a gull standing on it, watching the water. And I don't know if that's actually a haiku or not, but I love the question. It's an ongoing process for me.
David, can I just one follow-up and then I'll shut up. And in Japanese poetry, in classical Japanese poetry, is the syllabic count of any import?
Yes, that's key in the Japanese practice. And it's another reason why it might not be such a compelling circumstance in English language practice, because the languages are so different, English and Japanese. Again, Basho, he's my hero in all of this, but one of his most beautiful haiku poems was about the sources of elegance, the planting songs of the deep north. And the poem in Japanese, Furyu no hajime ya oku no taoeita. And what's interesting to me about it is that it doesn't quite work out as 5-7-5. It's more like 7-7. And I think that Basho was deliberately using planting songs from the northern part of Japan to come in and say, there is where haiku might have come from. And those sorts of things are I think, just wonderful.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for your poetry and for your wonderful translations.
Oh, thanks so much.